In a small town just outside of Des Moines, Iowa, where the winters are sharp and the memories sharper, lives a man named Walter Jennings. 62 years old, divorced, estranged from his only daughter, and long retired from the postal service, Walter had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. He walked the same streets every morning, fed the same stray cat outside his porch, and spoke only when necessary. But everything changed on a Monday morning that began just like any other, with cold coffee, unopened mail, and silence. What Walter didn't know was that this ordinary day would unravel a hidden chapter from his past, and lead him to the last place he ever expected: redemption. Walter Jennings had lived most of his adult life with one foot in the past and the other stuck in neutral. Every morning at 16:10 sharp, he brewed his coffee. Black. No sugar. Sat by the window, and stared at the mailbox across the street like it might one day deliver him something other than bills or political flyers. He didn't expect change anymore. Change, to Walter, was what other people chased when they had something left to prove. His house was modest, a single-story ranch with peeling paint and a lawn that hadn't seen a mower in weeks. A faded photo of a young girl, his daughter Emily, sat on the mantel, untouched for years. He didn't talk about her. He didn't talk much at all. That Monday, though, a letter arrived, not a bill, not junk. The envelope was hand-addressed, with no return address. The paper was thick, the ink slightly smudged, like someone had written it in a hurry, but cared just enough to press hard. Walter turned it over in his hands, staring at the name, to Walter Jennings. Nothing else. He didn't open it. Not right away. Instead, he placed it on the kitchen table, and walked 3 slow laps around the house, like circling a memory too fragile to touch. By noon, he was sitting back at the table, hands trembling slightly. He hadn't received a handwritten letter in decades. Not since the day his wife left, not since Emily last sent him a birthday card from college. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like gravel shifting beneath the weight of years, he tore it open. Inside was one sentence: "You don't know me, but I know who you were, and you need to know what happened." No signature, no explanation, just that one sentence, and a phone number at the bottom. A local Iowa number. Walter's first instinct was to throw it away. The past was a dangerous thing to dig up, especially when you'd spent years burying it. But something in that letter didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a mirror. And it had been a long time since Walter dared to look at himself. That evening, he stood outside with a half-lit cigarette, his third in over a year, and watched the sunset smear itself across the sky. He hadn't called the number. Not yet, but he had folded the letter neatly and tucked it into his wallet. Because maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something. Or the end of something else. Either way, the silence of his life had been cracked. The letter had stirred something in Walter. An itch behind the ribs, a soft ache he thought he'd long ago learned to ignore. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with an old shoebox in front of him, dust coating the lid like powdered regret. Inside were scraps of a life he no longer claimed, postcards from Emily's school trips, an old baseball ticket stub from their only father-daughter game, and a small stack of letters he had never sent. He had written them years ago, always late at night, when the guilt crept in and the bourbon flowed too freely. Letters to Emily, letters filled with apologies he couldn't voice in person. They were confessions without destinations, written, folded, and hidden away. He pulled one out, dated June 4, 2003, her 18th birthday. I know I missed the ceremony today. I know I missed more than that. Years, birthdays, first dances, all of it. And I know a letter doesn't fix what I broke. But I want you to know I was proud. I was always proud. I just didn't know how to show it without making everything worse. Love. Dad. He stared at the trembling handwriting, the ink faded at the edges. He remembered writing it while sitting on the front porch steps, the night after watching her graduation on a neighbor's camcorder. Too ashamed to show up himself. The phone number in the mysterious letter still burned in his mind. What if it was Emily? What if something had happened? But the voice in the back of his mind, the one that had kept him alone all these years, whispered, "What if she doesn't want to be found?" What if it's already too late? Walter folded the old letter and placed it beside the new one. He stood, poured himself a cup of decaf, and sat by the window. The street was empty, quiet. Just the way he'd lived for years. Safe, numb, uneventful. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar flickering in his chest. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But maybe it was the question that always came before hope: what if? 2 days passed before Walter found the nerve to call the number. He rehearsed what he'd say, over and over, each version thinner than the last. When he finally dialed, the ringtone lasted just long enough to make him want to hang up. Then, click. A woman's voice, calm and unfamiliar. Hello. Walter cleared his throat. I'm calling about a letter. I received one. No name, just a number. This number. Silence. Then a quiet breath. I was wondering if you'd call. Her voice was soft, but not fragile. Controlled. There was weight in it, like someone who'd been carrying truths for too long. I don't know who you are, Walter said, but I need you to explain. There was another pause. Then she spoke. My name is Teresa Malloy. I believe I knew your daughter. Walter's breath caught. Emily? Yes, but I didn't know her as well as I knew her mother. The name hit him like cold water. Claire. His ex-wife, the woman who had left without a forwarding address. The mother who had shielded Emily from the slow collapse of their family. Walter hadn't seen or heard from her in nearly 20 years. I was Claire's nurse, Teresa said quietly. Hospice. The last 3 months of her life. Walter stood, heart pounding. I didn't even know she was sick. I didn't know she'd passed. I know, Teresa said. Claire didn't want to be found. Not by anyone. But in the final weeks she talked about you. About Emily. About everything. Walter sat down slowly, the phone cold against his cheek. She asked me to write the letter. Teresa continued. But I couldn't bring myself to send it until now. She left something for you. A journal. Photographs. And a message. Walter's throat tightened. Why now? Because I met someone last week. A young woman who walked into the hospice center looking for answers. Her name is Lily. A pause. She said she's your granddaughter. The world shifted. Walter gripped the edge of the table. A granddaughter. Emily had a daughter. He hadn't even known if Emily was still alive. Teresa's voice softened. She wants to meet you, Walter. But she's scared. I think she just needs to know you care enough to show up. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just listened to the hum of the line, the wind outside, the thudding of his own heart. Then, finally, where do I go? The drive to Teresa's small home near Cedar Rapids was quiet, long, and heavy with memories. Walter hadn't been out of Des Moines in years, and the rural highways felt like traveling through another lifetime. When he arrived, Teresa was waiting on the porch. A middle-aged woman with gray streaks in her auburn hair, kindness in her eyes, and something cautious behind her smile. Inside, the living room was modest, clean, lived in. On the coffee table sat a small wooden box. Teresa nodded toward it. She asked me to give this to you directly, she said. She didn't want it mailed. She said it needed to be opened when you were ready. Walter sat down slowly, his fingers tracing the grain of the box lid. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside, neatly packed, were 3 things. A small leather-bound journal, a folded photograph, a sealed envelope with his name on it. He picked up the photograph first. It was old. Maybe 25 years. A snapshot taken in someone's backyard. Claire, standing beneath a tree, smiling, not the forced kind, but soft and real. Next to her was a young woman he didn't recognize, holding a child. A baby girl, no more than a year old. Walter's hand trembled. Is that? Yes. Teresa said quietly. That's Lily. Walter stared. Claire had been alive all those years, raising their granddaughter in silence. And Emily. She wasn't in the photo. The absence was loud, jarring. He turned the picture over. In Claire's handwriting. For the day he chooses to look back. With a shaky breath, he picked up the envelope and opened it. Walter, I never hated you. I was tired. Tired of the silence, the shame, the waiting. I wanted Emily to have peace. To have stability. You and I both failed her in different ways. But she was strong. She ran from us, yes, but not forever. She came back to me, once. Pregnant. Alone. She wouldn't say where she'd been, only that she couldn't face you. But she left Lily with me when the addiction got worse. I tried to hold her together, but some things cracked too deep. Emily disappeared again. It's been years. I never found her. But Lily, she's light, Walter. You still have a chance. Not to fix everything, but to begin again. Be the man you were afraid to be back then. Love, Claire. Walter sat frozen, the letter trembling in his grip. His daughter was still missing. His granddaughter. Alive, searching, maybe hurting. And he still had breath in his lungs and a second chance on the table. He looked at Teresa. Does Lily know about me? About Emily? She knows enough. Teresa said gently. But the rest, she's waiting to hear from you. Walter looked down at the photo once more. He wasn't sure what kind of grandfather he could be. But for the first time in decades, he was sure of one thing he wanted to try. Lily was waiting at the edge of the town library's community garden, sitting alone on a bench with her backpack hugged tight to her chest. Walter parked across the street and just sat in his car for a full 5 minutes, watching her. She couldn't have been more than 16. Dark curls tucked under a beanie, oversized hoodie, and the kind of guarded stillness that comes from growing up with too many questions. He stepped out slowly, heart hammering like he was about to walk into a confessional. As he crossed the street, she looked up. Their eyes met, hers wide, curious, a bit skeptical. His were tired, but open. You came, she said simply. I wasn't sure I would, Walter admitted. But I'm glad I did. She nodded, scooting over to give him space on the bench, though she kept a few inches between them. There was no hug, no tears, just quiet. After a long pause, Lily reached into her backpack and pulled something out, a small silver bracelet, tarnished with age, missing one of its little charm hearts. I think this was my mom's, she said, holding it gently. Claire gave it to me, said it had a story. I don't know what it is. Walter blinked, the memory crashing over him like a wave. That was Emily's, he whispered. I gave it to her for her 8th birthday. She wore it every day for years. She must have kept it, Lily said, even when she was wherever she was. Walter reached out, not to take it, but to hold her gaze. I'm sorry, he said. For not being there. For not knowing. For disappearing when I should have fought. Lily looked down at the bracelet. Teresa said you used to write letters. I did, he said. But I never sent them. Too ashamed. Too late. Do you still have them? Walter nodded. Would you want to read them? Lily hesitated, then offered the bracelet to him. Only if you'll wear this, she said. Just for a while. Until I'm ready to take it back. He took it, hands trembling. It barely fit his wrist, but he clasped it shut, like fastening himself to something he thought he'd lost forever. They sat there in silence for a long while. Grandfather and granddaughter. Strangers tethered by a single, fragile thread of memory and metal. The sky began to shift above them, golden streaks breaking through the clouds. I don't know what happens next, Lily said. Walter smiled, soft and unsure. Me neither. But maybe we figure it out together. She nodded. For the first time, she didn't look so alone. And neither did he. A week after their quiet reunion at the garden bench, Walter invited Lily on a short road trip. Just a few hours north to Decorah, where Claire had once taken Emily as a child. It's nothing fancy, he said. But your mom loved the river trails. Thought maybe you'd like to see them. They set off in Walter's aging Ford pickup, the radio humming softly between old country ballads and crackling static. At first, conversation was light, safe topics, easy laughs. But as the miles ticked by and the scenery shifted from concrete to fields and pines, Lily began to open up. I used to make up stories about you, she said, watching cornfields blur past. In my head, when I was little. Like, maybe you were a war hero, or a spy, or in the FBI. That's why you were gone. Walter chuckled. I don't know whether to be flattered or embarrassed. Lily smiled, just a little. Claire never said much. just that some people run from pain instead of through it. He nodded. She was right. But I'd like to stop running now. Suddenly. Bang. A sharp pop echoed under the truck. Walter gripped the wheel. The truck jerked to the side, and he pulled them onto the shoulder, heart racing. Flat tire. He muttered, climbing out. Sure enough, the front passenger side had blown. He cursed softly and opened the back to check for the spare. But it was gone. Lily joined him, frowning. No signal out here, she said, holding up her phone. They stood in silence, stranded in the middle of nowhere, just as the sky began to dim. Then, faintly, from down the highway, headlights. A dusty RV slowed, then pulled in behind them. A man in his 70s stepped out, sunburned, grinning. Need a hand? He asked. Walter hesitated. I don't have a spare. The man winked. Lucky for you, I got one. Same size. Within 30 minutes, the tire was changed. The man didn't ask for money. Just waved off Walter's offer with a laugh. Pay it forward, he said. Then added, world's full of second chances. Don't waste 'em. As the RV disappeared down the road, Lily looked at Walter. Was that normal? Walter shook his head, stunned. Not even close. She smiled. Maybe that was our miracle. He nodded, quietly agreeing. Because sometimes, miracles don't come with lightning or choirs. Sometimes, they come on 4 wheels, with a stranger and a spare tire. The delay on the highway pushed them off schedule, and by the time they rolled into Decorah, it was already dusk. They found a small roadside motel, peeling paint, neon flickering, and got 2 rooms side by side. Walter offered to cover dinner, and they walked to a diner just down the street. It wasn't fancy, but the food was hot. The waitress called everyone on, and the jukebox still worked. Over meatloaf and mashed potatoes, Lily asked a question Walter wasn't expecting. What were you like before? He blinked. Before what? Before all this. Before you became the man in the photo. Walter looked down at his plate. Honestly, I don't remember. Lily studied him, then leaned back. You know, I think you do. You just don't think it matters anymore. He laughed softly, not out of humor but recognition. Maybe you're right. He thought about it that night in his motel room. About who he was at 25. A rookie mailman, newly married, full of small-town pride and big dreams. He'd wanted to build a life, a legacy. He'd wanted to be the kind of father his own never was. But then Claire got sick during Emily's early years. The pressure mounted. The late-night shifts turned into distance. His silence became his shield. He hadn't meant to disappear. He'd just let go, one day at a time. The next morning, Lily asked if they could skip the trails and go somewhere else instead. Where? He asked. I don't know. Somewhere not in the brochure. So they drove aimlessly, through old county roads and forgotten farm towns. They stopped at a thrift store, where Lily found a first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird. They sat by a riverbank and skipped stones. Walter taught her how to whistle with a blade of grass. She showed him how to take a selfie. None of it was planned. And somehow, that made it matter more. That night, back at the motel, Walter sat on his bed with the journal Claire had left. He hadn't read much of it yet, afraid of what truths it held. But he flipped to a random page, somewhere in the middle. He's not a cruel man. He's just a quiet one. Too quiet. But even silence can break a heart if it lasts too long. He closed the book, eyes damp. Maybe he couldn't fix the past. But the man in that journal, the one Claire remembered, wasn't gone. He was just waking up. On their 3rd day of the trip, Walter and Lily stopped at a small farmer's market in a sleepy town called Elkader. It was the kind of place where people still made eye contact, where dogs wandered off-leash, and where the air smelled like cinnamon and rain-soaked earth. Walter had gone off to buy apples while Lily browsed through a stand of handmade jewelry. As he walked back toward her, he saw something unexpected. Lily, bent over, helping an elderly woman pick up a bag of spilled tomatoes. The woman thanked her profusely, and Lily simply smiled and said, "My grandma used to say tomatoes forgive anyone who's gentle." Walter paused. That was something Claire used to say. He had nearly forgotten. When Lily rejoined him, he said nothing. Just watched her. Noticing, maybe for the first time, how much of Claire's quiet strength lived in her. How she led with empathy, not fear. Later that afternoon, they stopped at a small cafe to rest. While Walter waited in line, Lily found herself sitting near a man hunched over a legal pad, face worn and eyes heavy. He looked lost. She offered him her leftover sandwich. "You look like you haven't eaten today." The man blinked in surprise. "That obvious?" "Yeah," she said. But in a human kind of way. They talked for a few minutes. His name was Marcus, a former high school teacher battling eviction after a health crisis. No insurance, no family. Just papers and panic. When Walter returned, Lily asked if they could give him a ride. Just a few blocks to a shelter nearby. Walter didn't hesitate. In the truck, Marcus looked at Walter and said, "You raised her well." Walter glanced in the rearview mirror. "I didn't," he said. "But I'm learning." That evening, Walter and Lily sat in silence under a canopy of stars at a rest stop picnic table, sipping hot chocolate from paper cups. "You know," Lily said, "I didn't come looking for a grandfather. I came looking for something good that still existed." Walter nodded slowly. "And did you find it?" She looked at him. "You helped a stranger today," she said. "You stopped for someone who needed you. That's more than most people do for their own." Walter didn't know what to say, so he said what felt right. "I'm proud of you." She smiled. "That means more than you think." That night, Walter wrote a new letter. "Dear Emily, I don't know where you are, or if you'll ever read this. But Lily's okay. She's better than okay. She's the best parts of you and Claire, and something entirely her own. Today she reminded me what decency looks like. What hope feels like. Maybe this is what redemption is. Not fixing everything, but choosing better one small moment at a time. I love you. Dad." He folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. Even if it never reached her, it had already reached someone else. Back in Des Moines a few days later, Walter sat alone on his porch steps, Lily asleep inside. He cradled a mug of lukewarm tea, the night air brushing against his skin like a memory returning. He hadn't planned to go. Not really. But the next morning, something shifted. Maybe it was the way Lily said, "You can't change the past, but maybe you can face it." Or maybe it was just time. So he drove to the address, scribbled in the back of Claire's journal. A halfway house outside Davenport. According to a brief entry, Emily had stayed there once, years ago. Maybe someone still remembered her. Maybe the house was worn but cared for, its paint new, its garden blooming. Inside, a receptionist greeted him warmly, then cautiously. "I'm looking for information about someone who might have stayed here," Walter said. "My daughter, Emily Jennings." The woman furrowed her brow, then typed into an old desktop. After a moment, she looked up. She was here. Briefly, but she didn't stay long. Walter's breath caught. "Do you know where she went?" She hesitated. "A man came by. She left with him. Signed herself out. We didn't have authority to stop her." Walter's stomach tightened. "Do you remember him?" "Not his name," she said. "But we keep records." She disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with a photocopied intake form. Scrawled in the margin was a first name, Jake. Walter's chest went cold. Jake Coleman. He knew that name. Emily had dated him in high school. A charming boy with slick lies and a volatile temper. Walter had tried to stop it once. But Claire said pushing too hard would only drive Emily deeper in. And now, this. He left the center in silence, gripping the page like it could bleed. For the first time, rage mixed with guilt. Not just at Jake, for whatever he had done, but at himself. For not showing up. For not being the father who knocked on that door. For letting Claire carry the weight of all of it. That night, back home, Walter sat Lily down. "I need to tell you about someone," he said. "Someone your mom trusted who didn't deserve it. Someone I should have protected her from." Lily listened, quiet and still. "Do you think she's alive?" she asked. Walter stared at the floor. "I don't know. But if she is," Lily said softly, "we should find her." He looked at her. Really looked. So young, yet speaking with the clarity of someone who'd already had to survive too much. "You'd want to meet her?" he asked. I'd want her to know I forgive her, Lily said. Even if she never forgives herself. Walter's voice cracked. You're stronger than I ever was. No, she said. You're the one sitting here now. That counts for something. The past couldn't be undone, but maybe it could be answered. And Walter knew he had one more journey left. It had been 3 weeks since Walter learned the name. Jake Coleman. Again. 3 weeks of silence, of waiting for a sign, of wondering if he should dig deeper. Or let it go. But Lily didn't let it go. She started making calls, reaching out to missing persons forums, posting on local support group pages. One night, she found a thread, barely active, where a woman named J93 had written, I don't know who I am anymore. I had a daughter once. I left her with someone safe. I don't know if I'm alive inside, but I still dream of being forgiven. The ep was traced to a women's shelter near Sioux City. Walter called. His voice shook as he asked if they had someone named Emily staying there. The answer came after a long pause. We do. She's not ready to talk to anyone, but if you want you can write. So he did. He sat at his kitchen table, where this whole story began, and put pen to paper. Emily, I don't deserve to ask anything of you. Not answers. Not forgiveness. I wasn't there when you needed me. I let your mother carry pain I should have shared. I let my silence speak louder than my love. But I met your daughter. Lily is brilliant. Kind. Fierce. She carries your strength, Claire's heart, and something all her own. She's the one who saved me. Pulled me out of the shadow of myself. I think she'd do the same for you. If you ever want to come home. Not to the old home, but a new one, we're here. No judgment, no questions, just a place to land. I love you, always did, still do, Dad. He mailed it. Days passed, then weeks, until one morning, Walter opened the door and found a small envelope on the porch. No stamp, just taped to the screen. Inside was a photo. A woman, thin but standing tall, arms around Lily on the same park bench where he first met his granddaughter. Behind them, the garden bloomed wild. On the back, one sentence. I am still learning how to be found. But I'm trying. Walter sat down on the porch, holding the photo like a prayer. He didn't cry. Not right away. But the weight in his chest loosened, like something long buried had finally breathed. That evening, Lily found him staring at the sky, photo still in hand. She came, he said. Lily smiled, eyes glistening. I know. We met last night. He looked at her, startled. She asked me not to tell you yet. She needed to see if she could do it, one step at a time. He nodded slowly. I'm proud of you, he whispered again. She took his hand. We're proud of us, she said. And for once, Walter believed it. Not every story ends with a grand gesture or a final reunion under perfect skies. Sometimes, the most powerful endings are quiet. Tender hands reaching across years of silence. Broken hearts learning how to beat in harmony again. Walter Jennings didn't rewrite his past. He didn't erase the mistakes, or reclaim the years lost in bitterness and fear. But he stood up. He showed up. He chose to love, even when it felt too late. And in doing so, he gave his granddaughter, and himself, a future. Lily found the answers she'd searched for, not in grand truths, but in simple acts: a shared meal, a handwritten letter, a long drive with windows down. She found strength not in her mother's perfection, but in her struggle, in her return. And Emily. She came back, still wounded, still healing, but with enough courage to believe she was more than what she'd lost. This wasn't a story about rescue. It was a story about choosing to reach, choosing to believe, choosing to begin again. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything.